My name is Macy Blake. I am 31 years old, and for the last 8 years, I have functioned as a human machine of tactical precision and cold, calculated logic. I spent a decade as a staff sergeant with the military police, and today I operate in the high-stakes world of private executive protection, where a single second of hesitation can cost a client a $1 million life. My home is a reflected image of my psyche, a 650-square-foot fortress of minimalism in the heart of downtown, where every surface is cleared of sentiment and the air smells faintly of gun oil and high-end floor wax. At precisely 2:04 a.m., the silence of my sanctuary was shattered by the sharp metallic vibration of my iPhone 15 Pro Max against the tempered glass of my nightstand. The notification light pulsed like a warning flare in the dark. It was a text from my mother, Patricia Blake, the matriarch of a dynasty built on old money and even older secrets. If you walk out that door, Madison, you are dead to this family. No money, no name, nothing. Let that traitor and her broken brat rot in the rain. I stared at the screen, my pulse not even rising above its resting 60 beats per minute. My mother had always used words like hollow point bullets, designed to expand and shatter upon impact, but I had long ago traded my heart for a Kevlar vest. The frantic, uneven pounding on my heavy steel-reinforced door started at 2:11 a.m. In my world, you do not reach for a phone when the door rattles at 2 in the morning. You reach for muscle memory. I was out of my 300 thread count charcoal sheets before the third strike, my hand closing instinctively around the textured grip of my duty belt staged perfectly on the chair beside the bed. I did not ask who it was. I moved with the silent, predatory grace of a woman who has cleared rooms in hostile territory, my bare feet making no sound on the polished concrete floors. I leaned into the cold metal of the door and peered through the wide-angle optical peephole. The hallway light, a flickering fluorescent tube that the building manager had neglected to replace, cast a sickly yellow pallor over the scene outside. There stood my sister, Savannah, swaying on her feet like a willow tree in a hurricane. Her left eye was already swollen into a horrific meat-colored purple slit, the skin stretched so tight it shone under the hallway lights. She was clutching the handles of a rusted manual Invacare wheelchair, her knuckles white and shaking. In that chair sat my 8-year-old niece, Chloe, whose small frame was trembling so violently that the metal frame of the wheelchair rattled against the door frame. Chloe was wrapped in a thin, soaked Disney princess blanket that had seen better days, her eyes wide and glassy with a brand of terror that no child should ever recognize. I disengaged the heavy-duty Medeco deadbolt and the secondary security chain with 2 swift, rhythmic clicks. The smell hit me immediately, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the ozone of the thunderstorm raging outside the building, and the cheap, cloying scent of the drugstore cologne my brother-in-law, Garrett, wore to mask his frequent benders. Savannah did not speak. She simply collapsed forward, her forehead thudding against my collarbone as the adrenaline that had fueled her flight finally evaporated. I caught her weight, my hands cataloging the injuries with clinical detachment even as a cold, familiar rage began to simmer in the base of my skull. I looked down at Chloe, whose manual wheelchair was missing a rubber grip on the left handle and had a visible layer of orange oxidation blooming on the spokes. This was the broken brat my mother had referred to, the child who had been born with spinal complications that the Blake family viewed as a personal insult to their genetic perfection. The rain was dripping off Savannah's tattered trench coat and onto my pristine floors, forming a dark, spreading pool that reflected the blinking red light of my security system. I pulled them both inside, the heavy door thudding shut with the finality of a tomb, sealing out the world and the venomous echoes of Patricia's threats. I looked at the digital clock on my kitchen microwave. 2:14 a.m. The war had officially moved from the shadows of my past into the center of my living room, and I knew with absolute certainty that the woman who had sent that text would not stop until she had burned everything I had built to the ground. Family is not blood. Family is the person who opens the door when the rest of the world has turned out the lights and left you to rot in the rain. The contrast between my reality and the life Savannah had been fleeing was a sickening visceral weight that settled in my gut as I looked at the bruised woman shivering on my floor. I have spent the last decade carving out a life defined by grit and self-reliance, living on black coffee from a dented Yeti tumbler and grinding through 14-hour shifts to protect executives who have more money than empathy. Every cent of my $85,000 salary is accounted for, channeled into a high-yield savings account or used to maintain my tactical gear, Because I know better than anyone that a safety net is something you weave yourself. Meanwhile, my sister had been trapped in a curated suburban nightmare in a zip code where the lawn care is more manicured than the people. Her husband, Kyle, is a parasitic entrepreneur who masquerades as a success story while wearing $300 Vineyard Vines performance polos and driving a leased BMW X5. All financed by the quiet misappropriation of Chloe's disability checks and my mother's occasional begrudging handouts. Our mother, Patricia, is the undisputed architect of this facade, reigning over a 4,500 square foot colonial home in the most prestigious pocket of the suburbs where the sterling silver is polished to a mirror sheen but the souls of the inhabitants are blacker than a moonless night in a combat zone. As I stood there, still holding a $4 lukewarm IPA that I had cracked open minutes before the world exploded, I realized the sheer magnitude of the injustice. While I was worried about the slight wear on my duty boots, Savannah was being treated like a punching bag in a house I used to call home, a place where the wallpaper costs more than some people make in a year but the walls are too thin to hide the sound of a hand striking flesh. Patricia's silence on Kyle's tempers was a calculated investment in family branding, a belief that a bruised daughter is preferable to a public scandal. I watched Savannah's hands shake as she tried to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her fingers fluttering near the purple hematoma that had closed her eye. She looked like a ghost in a house of mirrors, shattered and reflecting a dozen different versions of a woman who had finally run out of excuses. The air in my apartment was thick with the smell of wet wool and the metallic tang of fear, a sharp departure from the sterile, organized peace I fought so hard to maintain. I looked at the manual wheelchair, its cheap plastic wheels tracking mud and rainwater across my polished concrete, and I felt a cold, crystalline fury began to replace my clinical detachment. My mother had chosen the reputation of a deadbeat son-in-law over the safety of her own flesh and blood, essentially signing a warrant for Savannah's misery because it looked better on the annual Christmas card. I reached out and took the lukewarm beer, setting it down on the soapstone counter with a deliberate heavy thud. The time for observation had ended. I am a woman trained in the mechanics of violence and the logistics of protection, and as I looked at my sister's broken face, I knew that the Blake family's pristine reputation was about to meet the wreckage it had created. I had spent years guarding the lives of strangers, but now the mission had shifted to my own blood, and the cost of entry into my fortress was the total destruction of the lies that had kept Savannah in chains. Family isn't the name on the mailbox or the trust fund in the bank. Family is the person who sees the blood on your face and doesn't ask if you deserved it, but rather how much ammunition they need to make it right. The betrayal did not happen in some dark, secluded alleyway or a back alley bar. It unfolded within the pristine confines of a kitchen that smelled perpetually of expensive Earl Grey tea and high-concentrate bleach, a sterile environment where every surface was scrubbed to hide the rot beneath the floorboards. It started when Savannah discovered that Kyle, a man whose only real talent was professional-grade manipulation, had liquidated $4,200 from Chloe's medical trust, money earmarked for specialized physical therapy and the maintenance of her wheelchair, to fund a 3-day business trip to Las Vegas that consisted of nothing but high-stakes blackjack and premium bottle service at the Wynn. When Savannah confronted him with the bank statement, her voice trembling as she held the printed proof of his theft, Kyle did not offer an explanation or a shred of remorse. Instead, he used his fists to silence the truth with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew exactly where to strike so the bruises could be hidden by a high-collared blouse. Throughout the entire assault, my mother, Patricia, sat at the heavy mahogany table that had been in our family for 3 generations, calmly sipping tea from a delicate bone china cup as if the sound of a skull hitting a cabinet was nothing more than a minor domestic inconvenience. With a coldness that would make a career criminal flinch, Patricia looked at her own daughter, whose face was already beginning to bloom with the dark, mottled colors of trauma, and told her to stop being dramatic and to think of what the neighbors would say if a police cruiser appeared in their circular driveway. The betrayal was a layered masterpiece of cruelty, escalating from Kyle's physical violence to my mother's psychological warfare as she watched Savannah crawl toward Chloe's rusted wheelchair in a desperate attempt to flee the nightmare. As Savannah reached for the door, clutching the child who was the only pure thing left in that house of horrors, Patricia actually stood up and blocked the exit with her designer-clad frame, claiming with a straight face that Savannah was attempting to steal marital property by taking the very wheelchair that Chloe's trust had paid for. It was a scene stripped of any human warmth, A theater of the absurd where a mother chose the legal technicalities of a son-in-law's belongings over the life of her grandchild and the safety of her firstborn. I sat in my apartment listening to the jagged pieces of this story fall into place, my hands tightening into fists that felt like blocks of granite as I pictured the woman who birthed us choosing the aesthetic of a happy home over the survival of her children. The betrayal wasn't just the physical hits Kyle landed or the stolen money intended for a disabled child's care. The true, unforgivable sin was the silence of the woman who watched it happen and then reached for the kettle to boil more water. Patricia had turned our family home into a gilded cage where the only rule was the preservation of a lie, and she was willing to let Savannah bleed out on the Italian marble floor rather than admit that her perfect suburban dynasty was built on a foundation of violence and theft. As I looked at Savannah's swollen eye and Chloe's thousand-yard stare, I realized that the woman in the colonial mansion wasn't a mother anymore. She was a warden, and the house I grew up in was nothing more than a crime scene waiting for a cleanup crew. The most dangerous predators don't always growl. Sometimes they sit across from you at breakfast and ask if you want more sugar in your tea while they watch you drown. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but when the walls are built of silence and the foundation is made of betrayal, the only way to save yourself is to burn the whole structure down and never look back at the ashes. The transition from my minimalist sanctuary to the sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory of St. Jude's Hospital was a blur of high-speed maneuvers and tactical assessment as the paramedics wheeled Savannah into room 402 at precisely 3:45 a.m. The air in the hospital hallway smelled of industrial-grade floor stripper and the sharp, acidic tang of human misery, a scent I had become intimately familiar with during my years in the military police. While the medical staff worked behind a heavy privacy curtain to stabilize my sister and assess the internal damage, I retreated to the hospital cafeteria, a cavernous space occupied only by a few exhausted night shift workers and the low, mechanical hum of a vending machine. I sat at a scratched laminate table that vibrated slightly from the building's ventilation system and pulled a single grease-stained napkin from a metal dispenser. With the same clinical precision I used to map out security perimeters for high-value assets, I took a black pressurized ink pen and drew a bold, uncompromising line down the center of the paper. On the left side I wrote the words family loyalty in a script that looked increasingly fragile against the harsh overhead lights, and on the right side I simply wrote facts. The left side of the napkin remained a haunting, pristine void, a white space that represented 31 years of gaslighting and the hollow promises of a mother who valued the sheen of her silverware over the heartbeat of her daughter. On the right side, however, the ink bled into the cheap fiber as I catalogued the physical and financial wreckage of the Blake legacy with the detached efficiency of a forensic accountant. I listed the 2 cracked ribs that showed up on the preliminary X-ray as jagged shadows of Kyle's rage, the 1.5-inch laceration on Savannah's hip where she had caught the sharp corner of a mahogany end table, and the cold, hard number of $12,450 in missing disability funds that had been siphoned from Chloe's future. I stared at the list until the numbers burned into my retinas, realizing in that quiet 4 a.m. moment that love is nothing more than a tactical liability when you are dealing with a narcissist, but evidence is an asset that can be leveraged into a weapon. I did not shed a single tear because tears are a physiological waste of resources. Instead, I felt my heart rate settle into a steady, lethal rhythm, the kind that precedes an engagement in the field. I finished the last dregs of my black coffee, which had gone cold and bitter like the realization of my mother's betrayal, and felt the familiar weight of my training take over. The woman who had birthed us thought she could bury the truth beneath a layer of social standing and expensive tea sets, but she had forgotten that I was the one child who had learned how to fight back in the dirt. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen illuminating my face with a pale, ghostly light, and scrolled through a secure contact list that I had kept encrypted and untouched for 3 years. I stopped at a name that belonged to a world I thought I had left behind, a man who specialized in the kind of deep-dive financial forensics and off-the-books intelligence gathering that no suburban lawyer could ever hope to counter. I dialed the number, the ringing tone sounding like a countdown in the silence of the cafeteria, and waited for the voice on the other end to pick up so I could begin the process of dismantling my mother's gilded kingdom piece by piece. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins. Family is the person who keeps the receipts and knows exactly where to bury the bodies when the truth finally comes out in the wash. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was a witness for the prosecution, and the Blake family was about to learn that you cannot buy your way out of the wreckage you create. I met Deborah Langley at precisely 7:15 a.m. in an office that felt less like a place of business and more like a high-altitude predator's nest overlooking the city skyline. The air in the room was a heavy, sophisticated cocktail of old parchment, expensive leather-bound law books, and the sharp, acidic aroma of $15 an ounce espresso being pulled from a Jura Giga 10 machine in the corner. Deborah is a shark in a tailored midnight blue Chanel suit, a woman whose reputation for scorched earth litigation is whispered about in the hallways of the Superior Court like a ghost story for the wealthy and the corrupt. I sat across from her mahogany desk, my back straight with the muscle memory of a decade in uniform, and handed her a thick manila folder containing 14 months of meticulously organized bank transcripts. I had acquired these documents using a combination of Savannah's long-dormant power of attorney and a few lingering digital credentials from my days in the military police that I probably should have deactivated years ago. But in my line of work, access is the only currency that matters. I leaned forward, my voice dropping into the low, steady cadence I used when delivering tactical briefings, and told her that Kyle had been laundering federal disability funds through a shell LLC registered as North Star Consulting, which was nothing more than a ghost entity used to wash money for his gambling debts and designer wardrobe. I watched her eyes track the highlighted entries on the ledger, her sharp mind already calculating the statutory damages and the federal implications of defrauding a government-subsidized medical trust. To seal the casket, I pulled out my phone and played a 45-second recording of the audio captured by my doorbell camera at 3:30 a.m. when Kyle had shown up at my fortress of an apartment. The recording was crystal clear, capturing the wet, thudding sound of his fist against my reinforced steel door and his slurred, venomous threats to ruin my stripes and use his connections with the local precinct to make my life a living hell if I didn't hand over his property, by which he meant my sister and the child he had spent years breaking. The audio ended with a sharp, electronic click that seemed to echo in the silence of the high-rise office, and for a long moment, Deborah simply stared at the manila folder as if it were a weapon she was learning how to aim. Then she smiled, but it was not a smile of kindness or comfort. It was the baring of teeth that occurs when a predator realizes its prey has walked willingly into a kill zone. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso, her manicured thumb tracing the rim of the porcelain cup, and told me that she hadn't seen a case of documented fiduciary fraud and aggravated harassment this clean in over a decade. The contrast between my mother's polished tea parties and the cold, hard reality of federal wire fraud was about to become a public spectacle, and Deborah was clearly relishing the opportunity to dismantle a dynasty like the Blakes. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction settling in my chest, a feeling of tactical superiority that comes when the perimeter is secure and the target is in your sights. My mother thought she could use the family name as a shield to protect a monster like Kyle, but she had failed to realize that a name is just a string of letters once the Department of Justice gets involved. I didn't need her approval or her inheritance anymore because I had something far more powerful. The truth, documented in black and white and backed by a woman who made her living turning prominent families into cautionary tales. Family isn't the person who shares your last name. Family is the person who stands with you in the dark when you're loading the magazines for a war you didn't start but are damn sure going to finish. I stood up to leave, the weight of the mission finally feeling manageable, knowing that by the time the sun set on this city, the Blake family's pristine reputation would be nothing more than a pile of charred remains. The trap was set at the Porter County Courthouse in room 3B, a space that smelled of lemon-scented industrial wax and the stagnant air of bureaucracy that usually grinds down the desperate. But today it was a designated kill zone for the truth. Kyle arrived at exactly 9 a.m. sharp, flanked by Patricia as if they were walking a red carpet instead of a legal minefield, and the visual dissonance was staggering to anyone who knew the reality behind their curated masks. Patricia was draped in a $1,200 St. John knit suit in a shade of cream that suggested she had never touched a day of hard work in her life, while Kyle radiated the faux confidence of a man who smelled of Creed Aventus and unearned privilege. They had filed for emergency custody with a level of audacity that only the truly entitled possess, submitting a sworn petition that claimed Savannah was an unstable addict who had kidnapped Chloe in a fit of drug-induced psychosis. I watched them from the second row of the gallery, my posture reflecting the rigid discipline of my military police training, wearing a charcoal gray tactical blazer that concealed the tension in my shoulders but not the intent in my eyes. They were incredibly smug, leaning in to whisper to their high-priced family law attorney, A man whose hourly rate was likely higher than the monthly disability checks Kyle had been embezzling. Patricia kept adjusting her pearls with a delicate, practiced hand, casting disparaging glances toward Savannah as if my sister were a smudge on her otherwise perfect reputation that needed to be bleached away. They truly believed that their status in this town, their memberships at the country club, and the names etched onto local charity plaques would act as a kinetic shield against the consequences of their actions. I sat directly behind Savannah, who looked fragile but focused in a borrowed navy cardigan, and I felt the weight of the Samsung Galaxy Tab S9 Ultra in my hands, its screen synced and ready to interface with the court's overhead projection system. The bailiff called the session to order with a rhythmic thud of the gavel that sounded like the first shot of an engagement, and I saw Kyle straighten his silk tie, a predatory glint in his eyes as he prepared to play the role of the grieving, concerned father. He didn't realize that I had spent the last 72 hours mapping out his financial movements with the same intensity one used to track insurgents, or that Deborah Langley was currently standing at the petitioner's podium with a file that contained enough evidence to trigger a federal grand jury. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Thorne who had seen 1,000 liars in her career, looked over her spectacles at the group, her expression unreadable as she asked the parties to state their initial positions for the record. I waited for the precise moment of maximum exposure, my thumb hovering over the play button on the tablet, watching as Patricia gave Kyle a reassuring pat on the arm that was meant to signal their inevitable victory. They had spent decades weaponizing their appearances to crush anyone who stood in their way, but they had never encountered a tactical operator who viewed their social standing as nothing more than a target-rich environment. I could see the reflection of the courtroom lights in Kyle's polished Oxfords, and I knew that within the next 20 minutes, those shoes would be walking him straight into a holding cell. Family isn't the prestige of your lineage or the designer labels you wear to hide your bruises. Family is the person who keeps the cold, hard data in a cloud-synced folder and waits for the perfect moment to pull the pin on the truth. The air in room 3B grew heavy as Deborah opened her first exhibit, and I felt the digital connection click into place, signaling that the Blake family's reign of silence was about to be broadcast in high definition for the world to see. The public execution of the Blake family's reputation began with a deceptive quiet as Judge Evelyn Thorne peered over her mahogany bench and asked for any concrete evidence regarding the alleged unfitness of the mother. Deborah Langley did not offer a grand opening statement or a rehearsed emotional plea. Instead, she stood up with the cold, predatory grace of a professional who knew she had already won and gave me a single, sharp nod. I tapped the glass of my tablet, and the courtroom was suddenly flooded with the distorted high-decibel rasp of Kyle's voice captured by my Ring Video Doorbell Pro at 3 a.m, his words echoing off the sterile walls like a death knell as he bragged that Patricia had enough pull in this town to make the police ignore a few bruises and that Savannah was nothing more than background noise. The air in room 3B seemed to thicken as the recording played, catching the sound of Kyle's heavy fist thudding against my door while he screamed about his property, a term he used for a wife and a disabled child with the same casual ownership one might use for a used car. As the audio faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, the overhead projector flared to life, casting a series of meticulously organized Excel spreadsheets onto the 10-foot screen behind the witness stand in high-definition clarity. The data points were a forensic roadmap of a 3-year betrayal, showing a line-item entry of $850 spent at a Las Vegas strip club followed by a $1,200 charge for a custom-fitted set of tailor-made Stealth 2 golf irons. These expenditures were not just numbers on a page. They were highlighted in a visceral, bleeding red because each transaction was time-stamped within 48 hours of a cancellation notice from Chloe's Pediatric Physical Therapy Center due to non-payment of her $400 monthly deductible. I watched the court reporter gasp, her hand shaking so violently that her digital stenotype pen clattered onto the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the stunned room. Patricia's face underwent a horrific slow-motion transformation, shifting from a mask of calculated indignation to a ghostly, translucent white that made the expensive St. John's suit look like a shroud. She looked toward her son-in-law, the man she had protected as an investment in her own social standing, and I saw her hand flutter to the pearls at her throat as if they were suddenly choking her. The perfect family was being dismantled in 12 minutes of cold, hard data that stripped away the veneer of the colonial mansion and the country club memberships to reveal a foundation of fraud, child neglect, and systemic abuse. Kyle's smug expression had completely collapsed, replaced by the panicked, darting eyes of a cornered animal as he realized that the judge was not looking at him as a victim, but as a felon who had siphoned federal funds from his own daughter's medical trust. The judge's pen moved across her notepad with a sharp, rhythmic scratching sound that was the only other noise in the room as the evidence of $12,450 in embezzled funds scrolled past for everyone to see. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled, feeling the immense weight of the truth finally crushing the lies that had kept my sister in a state of perpetual fear. This wasn't just a custody hearing anymore. It was a crime scene, and the fingerprints of my mother's complicity were all over the digital paper trail. Family is not the name you defend at the cost of your soul or the secrets you bury to keep the neighbors from talking. Family is the person who holds the flashlight in the dark until every roach is exposed to the light of day. As Deborah turned to face the judge, her Chanel suit catching the fluorescent light, I knew that the Blake dynasty had not just been defeated, it had been erased by the very logic they thought they were above. The judge did not merely deny the emergency custody petition. She leaned over the bench with a cold, predatory focus and issued an immediate bench warrant for Kyle on charges of felony embezzlement of federal funds and aggravated domestic assault. The transition from a civil hearing to a criminal apprehension happened with the terrifying speed of a tactical breach, as two court officers moved in from the perimeter before Kyle could even process the shift in the room's atmosphere. I watched with clinical detachment as his $300 Vineyard Vines performance polo crinkled and bunched under the aggressive grip of the law, his wrists forced behind his back with the sharp, metallic ratcheting of Smith & Wesson handcuffs that echoed through the silent gallery. The smell of his expensive Aventus cologne seemed to sour in the air, replaced by the copper tang of pure, unadulterated panic as he realized the status he had spent years cultivating was no match for a documented paper trail of federal fraud. Patricia, seeing the walls of her carefully constructed dynasty collapsing in real time, stood up with a jagged, frantic energy and attempted to storm toward the heavy oak exit doors of room 3B. She didn't make it 5 steps before Deborah Langley intercepted her with the fluid precision of a seasoned litigator, stepping into her path and thrusting a set of legal papers into her manicured hands. It was a subpoena for witness tampering and financial complicity, a direct result of the evidence we had gathered proving she had used her own accounts to shuffle the stolen disability funds when Kyle's credits ran dry. My mother's mouth opened in a silent, perfect O of shock, her $1,200 St. John's suit suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had been cancelled mid-performance. She looked at me, her eyes darting with a mixture of venom and a desperate, pathetic plea for the loyalty she had never earned, but I kept my expression as flat and unreadable as a desert horizon at dawn. I sat there in my charcoal tactical blazer, the weight of the tablet still warm in my lap, feeling the immense gravity of the moment settle over the room like a layer of fine dust. The woman who had told me at 2:04 a.m. that I would be dead to the family was now the one whose name was being dragged into the public record as a co-conspirator in the abuse of her own granddaughter. There was no joy in the sight, only the grim satisfaction of a mission successfully executed and a perimeter finally secured against a lifelong threat. The court officers led a sobbing, stumbling Kyle through the side door toward processing, his polished Oxford scuffing against the linoleum in a way that signaled the end of his time in the sun. Patricia remained frozen in the center of the aisle, clutching the subpoena to her chest as if it were a shield, while the court reporter methodically packed away her equipment, the clicking of the keys finally silenced. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled, and walked toward Savannah to place a steadying hand on her shoulder. We had walked into that courthouse as victims of a legacy built on silence and polished silver, but we were leaving as the architects of its destruction. Family isn't the name on a trust fund or the person who demands your silence to protect their reputation. Family is the one who carries the evidence into the light and stands guard while the monsters are led away in chains. As we moved toward the exit, passing my mother without a single word or a glance, I realized that the Blake family wasn't dead because I had walked out the door. It was dead because the truth had finally walked in. We stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp morning air of Porter County, leaving the wreckage of a 4,500 square foot lie behind us forever. 2 weeks after the gavel fell in room 3B, the fallout from the Blake family's collapse was total, a systematic demolition of a legacy that had taken 3 generations to build and only 12 minutes of forensic data to destroy. Kyle's business assets, which consisted primarily of shell companies and laundered disability funds, were frozen by a federal injunction that stripped him of his leased BMW X5 and his designer wardrobe before he could even post bail. He is currently trading his $300 Vineyard Vines polos for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit while facing 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for felony embezzlement and wire fraud, a sentence that will likely be served in a facility far less comfortable than the country club locker rooms he once frequented. The suburban nightmare he had constructed for Savannah has been dismantled by the Department of Justice, and the parasitic entrepreneur is now just another inmate number in a system that does not care about his golf handicap or his social connections. Patricia's social standing in the Heights, the curated world of garden parties and charity galas that she valued more than her own children's safety, is officially dead and buried beneath the weight of public scandal. The woman who once reigned over the local elite was forced to resign from the country club board via a frantic, rambling email sent at 4 a.m., a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable shunning that follows a subpoena for financial complicity. She tried to call my secure line 12 times in a single night, the notifications lighting up my minimalist nightstand like a frantic SOS from a sinking ship, but I blocked her number after the very first ring without a second thought. I have spent my adult life trained in the art of tactical negotiation and high-stakes protection, and one thing I learned early in my military career is that you do not negotiate with terrorists, even if they happen to share your mitochondrial DNA. I stood in my 6,500 square foot apartment, the silence now a comfortable companion rather than a shield, and watched the sun rise over the city skyline with a clarity I haven't felt since I first put on my uniform. Savannah and Chloe are safely tucked away in a secure corporate housing unit I arranged through my private security firm, a high-rise sanctuary with 24-hour biometric access and a view of the park that actually feels like a new beginning. We have started the process of reclaiming the $12,450 that Kyle stole, but the real victory isn't the money. It's the fact that for the first time in 31 years, the Blake name no longer carries the weight of a threat. The colonial mansion in the suburbs is being prepared for a short sale to cover Patricia's mounting legal fees, and the sterling silver she loved so much will likely be liquidated to pay for the defense of the crimes she watched happen in her own kitchen. Family is not a biological obligation or a brand name that you protect at the cost of your integrity. Family is a choice you make every single day when you decide whose back you are going to cover when the world turns hostile. My mother thought she could use her status as a weapon to keep us in line, but she underestimated the daughter who learned how to build a fortress out of facts and a weapon out of the truth. As I prepared my morning coffee, the steam rising in a steady white column against the gray concrete of my kitchen, I realized that the only person who had truly walked out of that family was the woman who had traded her soul for an Earl Grey tea set. I am Macy Blake, and while I may not have a dynasty anymore, I have something far more valuable. A perimeter that is finally, irrevocably secure. Family isn't the blood you share. It is the person who stays to help you sweep up the glass after the windows have been blown out. My mission is complete, and for the first time in my life I am not just guarding a client. I am guarding a future that belongs entirely to us. I moved Savannah and Chloe into a high-security condominium on the 22nd floor of the Atlas building, a structure that functions more like a vertical fortress than a residential complex, featuring 24-hour on-site surveillance and a dual authentication key fob system required just to activate the elevator. The air in this new space is clean and filtered, a sharp departure from the stagnant scent of bleach and betrayal that defined their previous life, and for the first time in nearly a decade, my sister can sit in a room without her eyes darting toward the door every time a shadow shifts in the hallway. I spent $6,400 of my personal tactical reserve savings to purchase a Permobile M3 Corpus power wheelchair for Chloe, a mid-wheel drive marvel of medical engineering finished in a sleek platinum silver that provides her with the independence she was denied by a father who viewed her mobility as a line-item expense for his gambling debts. Watching her navigate the hardwood floors with the precision of a joystick-controlled rover, her face lit by a rare and fragile smile, was worth every single cent of the overtime I pulled guarding corporate assets in the city's high-risk zones. The security of the Atlas building isn't just about the reinforced glass or the encrypted intercom system. It is about the psychological peace that comes when you realize the person who used to hunt you is currently behind a set of steel bars in a federal holding cell. Savannah no longer flinches when a floorboard creaks or when the refrigerator cycles on in the middle of the night. A physiological reset that is taking place one quiet hour at a time as she realizes that the perimeter I built for her is impenetrable. We celebrated our first full week of freedom by ordering $60 worth of authentic Thai food from a local spot on 4th Street, requesting extra spicy drunken noodles and green curry that arrived in steam-vented plastic containers. We didn't bother with the dining table or the formal etiquette that Patricia used as a social weapon. Instead, we sat directly on the polished floor of the living room, surrounded by the unpacked boxes of a new life, and ate until we were breathless from the heat of the chilies. It was, without question, the best meal of my entire life, not because of the culinary complexity, but because the only thing on the menu was safety and the absolute absence of fear. The city lights twinkled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows like a field of static, a reminder that the world is vast and that the Blake family's narrow, suffocating influence has finally been reduced to a footnote in a court transcript. I watched my sister reach for a spring roll with a hand that didn't shake, and I felt the last of my own combat-ready tension begin to dissipate into the warm, spicy air of the apartment. I have spent my career protecting people I didn't know and securing locations I didn't own, but standing watch over this $60 dinner on a condo floor felt like the highest-stakes mission I have ever successfully completed. Family is not the house you are forced to live in or the people who demand your silence to protect a brand. Family is the people who help you move your boxes into a place where you can finally breathe, and the sister who shares her spicy noodles with you while the world outside finally stays outside. The $6,400 for the wheelchair and the $60 for the Thai food were the best investments I have ever made, a down payment on a future where Chloe can move forward and Savannah can finally stop looking back. My name is Macy Blake, and while I may have lost a mother and a brother-in-law to the gears of the justice system, I gained a sanctuary that no amount of old money could ever buy. As we finished the last of the curry, the quiet hum of the city served as a backdrop to our new reality. A world where the only rules are honesty, loyalty, and the knowledge that the door is locked from the inside for all the right reasons. Would you like me to continue the story and describe the final confrontation with Patricia as she attempts one last desperate reach for control before the court case is finalized? The final attempt at my destruction arrived not in a courtroom or a dark alley, but in the sterile, high-pressure environment of my commanding officer's office at precisely 8 a.m. My CO, a man with 30 years of service and a face like weathered granite, called me in for a chat regarding a formal abuse of authority complaint filed by Patricia Blake, who had used her dwindling social capital to claim I had used military-grade surveillance and intimidation tactics against a civilian family. The air in his office smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint, lingering scent of old coffee, a sharp contrast to the expensive perfumes my mother had used to mask her true nature for decades. I did not offer an emotional defense or a panicked explanation. Instead, I moved with the disciplined economy of a seasoned operator and placed a heavy, matte black folder on his mahogany desk. Inside was a certified copy of the Porter County Court transcript from Room 3B, the federal arrest record for Kyle, and a notarized statement from Savannah's medical team at St. Jude's detailing the extent of the physical trauma she had endured under the roof Patricia had defended. He read the documents in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight in the small room, his eyes scanning the forensic evidence of the $12,450 in embezzled federal funds and the recording of Kyle's threats at my door. When he reached the final page, he closed the folder with a deliberate heavy thud that sounded like the closing of a tomb on the Blake family's influence. He looked up at me, his expression softening just a fraction, and told me to take a full week of administrative leave to ensure my sister and niece were fully transitioned into their new lives. "Good work, Macy," he said, using my name with a level of respect that no trust fund or country club membership could ever purchase. And then he informed me that instead of the disciplinary action my mother had prayed for, I was being put forward for a formal commendation for my role in uncovering a multi-year federal fraud scheme. I walked out of that office and into the morning sun, feeling the literal and figurative weight of my stripes settling more firmly onto my shoulders than they ever had before. The system, which my mother had tried to weaponize as a tool of oppression and silence, had instead functioned as a crushing weight against those who thought they were above the law. Patricia's desperate attempt to ruin my career was the final, dying gasp of a woman who had realized that her pearls and her prestige were no match for a daughter who knew how to leverage the truth with tactical precision. I am no longer just a staff sergeant or a security specialist. I am the survivor of a dynasty that traded its humanity for appearances, and I have emerged from the wreckage with my integrity and my family intact. Family is not the person who tries to strip you of your honor to save their own skin. Family is the sister waiting in a secure condo with a child who can finally move through the world on her own terms. As I pulled my vehicle out of the military installation and headed toward the Atlas building, I realized that the war was finally over and the perimeter was officially cold. I had spent my life guarding the interests of others, but the most important mission I ever accepted was the one that started at 2:11 a.m. when I opened my door to a broken sister and a trembling child. The Blake legacy is now nothing more than a series of case numbers in a federal database, and the only name that matters now is the one I've worked for every single day of my life. The air outside felt different, lighter, and filled with the promise of a future where the only thing we have to protect is our peace. Family is the blood you spill to protect the innocent, and the silence you break to ensure the guilty never hurt anyone again. I am Macy Blake, and my stripes have never shone brighter than they do today. Now my home has returned to a state of profound, intentional quiet that feels less like a void and more like a hard-won victory. There is no more frantic pounding at 2:11 a.m., no more high-decibel vibrations from a phone delivering venomous ultimatums, and no more metallic tang of adrenaline coating the back of my throat. The only sounds that occupy the 650 square feet of my minimalist fortress are the low rhythmic hum of the Samsung bespoke refrigerator and the soft distant whir of the ventilation system filtering the air into something pure and breathable. In the heavy silence of the midnight hours, I sit on my balcony overlooking the city's grid of amber streetlights, nursing a single glass of neat bourbon and absorbing the absolute knowledge that Chloe is sleeping in a bed with clean sheets and a door that she never has to bolt from the inside. I have spent my entire adult life operating under the assumption that family was a debt you could never fully repay, a burden of blood that required you to ignore the rot for the sake of the reputation, but I finally understand that family isn't about the DNA you share or the name etched into a mahogany headstone. Family is about the person who refuses to let you bleed out on a cold kitchen floor while they sip Earl Grey tea and worry about what the neighbors in the Heights might think of the noise. To Patricia and Kyle, who are currently navigating the sterile, uncompromising reality of the federal legal system and the social wreckage of their own making, I have only one final message that I delivered through the silence of a blocked number and a served subpoena. Do not ever look back toward the lives you tried to shatter, and do not mistake my current distance for a lack of vigilance, because I am the one still standing in the tactical shadows, and I have spent my career proving that I never miss my target when the safety of my own is on the line. Every time Kyle hears the heavy mechanical clink of a cell door or Patricia feels the cold shoulder of a former socialite friend at the grocery store, they will be reminded that they were dismantled by the very logic and precision they tried to weaponize against us. The colonial mansion with its polished silver and black-hearted secrets is being swallowed by the legal fees of a losing battle, and the legacy they prized above human life has been reduced to a cautionary tale in a Porter County archive. I look at the digital clock on my wall as it ticks over to 2:14 a.m., the exact moment the war began 2 weeks ago, and I feel a sense of completion that no military commendation could ever provide. I have secured the perimeter, I have neutralized the threat, and I have extracted the assets that matter most from a combat zone that was disguised as a suburban home. My life is no longer defined by the expectations of a matriarch who valued appearances over her own daughter's heartbeat, but by the quiet breathing of a sister who has finally stopped flinching at the sound of a settling floorboard. The bourbon is cold, the air is still, and the mission is irrevocably over. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you had the courage to cut the anchor of a toxic lineage to keep your own ship from sinking into the dark. Family isn't who you start with. It is who is still standing beside you when the smoke clears and the truth is the only thing left standing in the room. I am Macy Blake, and for the first time in 31 years, the silence in my home is exactly what I always wanted it to be.